Hey everyone, this is Catalin, and today's guest is Nir Eyal. He's an Israeli-born American author, lecturer, and investor known for his best-selling book, Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and now author of Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life, which was released a couple of months ago and can be acquired online and in stores pretty much everywhere. He sold two technology companies, and since 2003, and he now works with companies and teams to help them design more engaging products. He also taught a neuroscience class at the university, a Stanford Graduate School of Business, and has been featured and contributed in TechCrunch, Business Insider, Psychology Today, and many other sources. Nir, thank you so much for taking the time and spending it with us and talking about your new book. It's
My
exciting.
pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Nir, why don't we, and this is what I referred to before I started the recording, I do think it would be useful before we get into the new book to kind of like give like a 2-minute overview of Hooked, kind of like the model of trigger and action reward and everything, so people have that in the background, and kind of like how this book was born, and then I have kind of like some specific questions about the new book, and we're going to go from there.
Sure. So Hooked is about over 5 years old now, and the book did very well. It surprised me more than anyone. The book has sold about 250,000 copies so far, and it's an insider's perspective into how we can build more engaging products and services. So the idea behind why I wrote Hooked was that I wanted to share the secrets of how companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and Slack and Snapchat build their products and services to be so sticky. What is it about these products and services that makes them so habit forming? And so at the core of every habit forming product is what I call the Hooked model, which is a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. So if you think about a product, you can take your pick: Slack, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Even in the enterprise space, companies like Salesforce, GitHub, Stack Overflow, you have what's called a trigger, which is an external trigger and an internal trigger. We'll get back to the internal trigger in a minute. The external trigger is some kind of call to action, something in our outside environment that tells us what to do. It's a ping, a ding, a ring, some kind of notification that prompts us to action. The second step of the hook is the action phase, which is where we have the user do the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. It can be opening the app, something very, pushing the play button, scrolling a feed, very, very simple behaviors that get us to the next step of the hook, the reward phase. The reward phase is where the user's itch is scratched, and it tends to be what's called a variable reward. This will be in the form of some kind of uncertainty, some type of mystery, some type of unknown that scratches the user's itch, that gives them what they came for, and yet leaves them wanting more. So it's why we have the variable rewards of scrolling a news feed are very similar to the variable rewards of pulling a slot machine. There's uncertainty, there's mystery there. And it's inherent in all sorts of engaging products and services. It's what makes a book interesting. It's what makes a movie fun to watch. It's what makes a sports match interesting, is variability, mystery, uncertainty. And then finally, the most important step, and the one that most people forget with the Hooked model, is the investment phase. And the investment phase is where I propose something very different from the standard trigger action reward framework, but really the investment phase has to do with products as opposed to habits in our day-to-day lives, or behavioral conditioning, or when it comes to changing behavior offline. When it comes to online behaviors, you really want to make sure you are asking the user to put something into the product to make it better with use. And that can come in the form of data, content, followers, reputation, skill, anything that accrues value the more the product is used. And that critical investment phase does two things. One, it stores value. It makes the product better the more and more it's used. And second, it loads the next trigger so that when you're using a product like, let's say, Instagram, and you like something, comment on something, follow somebody, now you have a reason for the company to load the next trigger and reach out to you again with some kind of notification, loading the next trigger, sending you through the hook model once again. And so it's through these 4 successive steps: trigger, action, reward, investment. This is how preferences are shaped, how our tastes are formed, and how our habits take hold, so that over time, the product doesn't even need those external triggers. They trigger people through internal triggers, through these uncomfortable emotional states, stress, fatigue, loneliness, uncertainty, anxiety, whatever it might be. We begin to associate a product's use with the internal trigger that we are trying to scratch, the itch that we're trying to scratch. So when we're feeling lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we're bored, we check the news, sports scores, stock prices, Pinterest, Reddit, YouTube. We use these products to satiate some kind of internal trigger, which means the company doesn't have to spend any money on advertising, doesn't need to annoy you with spammy messages. You're using the product on your own out of habit. And so that's where the habit really does take hold.
And thank you for that brief explanation. And now looking at that and kind of like looking at your new book and kind of like the whole topic of it, what I think is intriguing is that superficially, at least, well, even fundamentally, they're complete polar opposites. And it seems kind of contradicting. Like you first did this, and then you kind of did the polar opposite. So can you walk us a bit over the story of how you went from that to realizing and kind of like doing this book now?
Yeah, so if Hooked is about how to build good habits in our customers' lives, then Indistractable is how do we break bad habits. It's two sides of the same coin. And so it's my expertise being in the industry, understanding how these products are built. I can offer, I think, a great deal of insight and help people separate the fact from the fiction when it comes to how do we make sure that we get the best out of these technologies without letting them get the best of us. I think today the narrative is very polarizing. It's either technology is awesome, it's the best thing ever, or technology is terrible, it's hijacking your brain, it's addicting you. And the fact of the matter is that it's somewhere in between, right? It's about how we use these things, how much we use them, who is using them, and what we would be doing instead of using them. That's where we judge, hey, which of these products and services are serving us versus which do we feel like we are serving. And so what I want to help people do, I don't tell people which tools they should use. I don't think any of them are inherently good or bad. It's about how we use them. And so what I want to help people do is to help them do whatever they want to do in their life that they themselves want to do, but for some reason aren't doing. And this is not a new problem, right? Plato talked about this 2,500 years before the iPhone. He talked about akrasia, the tendency that we all have to do things against our better interest. Distraction did not start with the iPhone. It did not start with Facebook. And clearly, my book Hooked was about how we can steal those techniques from the tech companies. My book was published in 2014, right? Facebook and Google and these guys were started 2006, 2007.
Yep.
So, what I wanted to do was to expose how these techniques can be used to build good habits, but then Indistractable teaches you how to break bad habits.
Yeah. And I at the end, I want to leave that at the end, maybe because I think it's a much more like philosophical conversation, like is technology good or bad?
If it's on your mind, go for it. Let's do it.
Yeah, so there's this, on this side of the world, like on technology is good or bad, there's this side of the world that say, oh, technology is ripping us off, technically speaking, and they're stealing our attention and all this side. And on the other side, there's people like, well, maybe Gary Vaynerchuk, maybe other people that basically saying that they're just amplifying you. The same way as you making money, it's like if you're a bad person and you make a lot of money, you're gonna be a worse person. You're gonna be an even worse person. If you're a good person and you make a lot of money, you're gonna be a better person, right? So it's the same thing maybe with technology. It's an amplifier of internal, let's say, psychological structures that people already have in place. And of course, it's like because it's technology, it's kind of an exponential thing. So of course, people that, for example, are prone to being depressed or prone to being anxious are more likely to use these technologies and whatnot because they're more likely to have those internal triggers that drive them to use these things. So where do you stake on that? Overall, I think it's pretty unanimous that the overall positive, it's like the overall net positive of technology is incredibly outrageous compared to the overall negative, and nobody can really debate that. Well, outside of Peter Thiel and whatnot, who says that, well, Peter Thiel, no, because he believes in stagnation, but technology, he's an investor, so in Facebook and all these things. So where do you stake on that? Because I think that's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I think the media, the traditional media, is where we get a lot of the hate for these technologies because they're in the same business. I mean, they're losing market share to these media companies, and so that's why we see newspapers and television stations love to tell you why these technologies are horrible and they're melting your brain, and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram are the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
Because that's the competition. Guess what? The newspapers make money by selling your attention, just like the social media companies do. They sell it to advertisers.
So much with an unbiased opinion, right?
Impossible. I mean, I've talked to so many journalists who are terrified, and they hate these social media companies because they see what's happening. I mean, it is a direct competitive threat to their business model. Big surprise. But I think we need a more nuanced view. I think that I think one of the most pernicious things that I hear, and by the way, I'm not a tech apologist. I think there's lots of things that these companies have screwed up that they could do a lot better, and they're learning. I mean, they're spending billions of dollars to fix a lot of the problems. So when it comes to data incursions, when it comes to their monopoly status, there's some serious questions there. When it comes to political interference, lots of stuff that they could improve. But I think that this one question around, is technology hijacking our brain? Is it addicting us? Come on, that's stupid. It's the scientific literature doesn't support it. It's not something, and I'm very careful with my words here. It does addict some people, okay? Just like alcohol addicts some people, but not everyone who has a glass of wine with dinner is an alcoholic. Why do we think that everyone with a Facebook account is addicted? It's ridiculous. Some people are addicted, but not everyone, not even close. It's single-digit percentages. We're not addicted. We are distracted. And we're distracted because these things are awesome.
Yeah.
Why. We love them. They're great. They're entertaining. They're interesting. They connect us to people. And so that's why we get distracted by them from time to time. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with Indistractable, is that every generation has their distractions. People talked about the radio being distracted, the television, rock and roll music, comic books. It's literally the same exact words that these Chicken Little tech critics are saying now, the sky is falling. It's literally the same words to the T that they use about how it's hijacking your brain, it's mind control, it's addicting everyone, turning everybody into zombies. It's just not true. But we as users want it to be true. We really want it to be true. Why? Because when something is an addiction, there's a drug, there's a pusher, there's a dealer, there's someone doing it to us. But when we call it what it really is, not an addiction, but a distraction, now I got to do something about it. Now it's my responsibility. That's no fun. And so that's what I'm fighting against, because I think by calling them addictive and by saying it's addicting everyone and saying it's hijacking our brain, we unwittingly make it true, right? This is called learned helplessness. When I say, oh, my kids, the video games, they just won't stop playing because the video games are hijacking their brain, or I just can't stop checking Facebook. What am I going to do? The algorithms have controlled my mind. Guess what? We stop trying.
Yeah.
We don't do anything about the problem. We just blame something else for causing the problem, when really there's so much we can do. I just wrote a 250-page book to tell you how to fuck Facebook, right? How to stop using these stupid technologies if you don't want to. If you do want to, great. I'm going to show you how to use it in a way that's smart, in a way that improves your life, and not let these technologies use you, to make sure you use the technology.
Yeah. And I think there's some great work. I mean, I was just looking at your Twitter, and you just published the full 80-page exercises and all this. I was like, God, this is great work. And by the way, you guys can check that on Twitter. I think it's a pinned post or something. You just posted a 80-page exercises and action items people can do, which is kind of cool. I was just looking through that. But just to touch on your point, personal responsibility seems to be the underlying theme of what you're saying, which is a much higher philosophical debate and whatnot. But I do like about your book that it's, at least for everybody, it's a highly practical way to actually get something done from the tactical level up, and then solve the high level things as well. Because the high level things are so nuanced and so vague, and all these, it's hard. I don't know how it's a different problem. So talking about your book a little bit, the core idea that I understood from your book is that there's this thing that's opposite to being distracted, which is called traction, not being focused. And as a pendulum to that, it goes from being distracted to having more traction, when you're swayed by external and internal triggers. So can you talk a little bit about that, and kind of like, I know
Sure.
it goes back to your personal responsibility, kind of like people blaming the external ones, but how
Yeah.
are those, how is the balance between those, and how do they work, and why should
Sure.
we
Yeah.
care?
So if we think about what is distraction, the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. Traction and distraction, actually, the Latin root is the same. It's trahare, which means to pull. And they both end, you'll notice, in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N. That spells action. So traction is any action that pulls us towards what we want to do, things that we do with intent. The opposite of traction is distraction, anything that pulls us away from what we plan to do. So why is this important? 2 reasons. Number one, anything can be a distraction. If you sit down at your desk like I used to do and say, okay, now I'm going to work on that big project. Now I'm finally going to focus. Now I'm finally going to finish that thing I said I was going to finish that I've been procrastinating. Right after I check email, right? Right after I check that Slack channel, right after I Google this quick thing, it feels worky, right? It feels like something that is productive to do. But if it's not what you plan to do, it is just as much of a distraction. In fact, those type of distractions are more sinister because it's not obvious that they are distractions. If you sit down and you start watching YouTube videos, well, that's clearly a distraction, right? If you're playing video games or comic books, okay, that's clearly a distraction. But if you're checking email when you said you would work on that big project, that is also a distraction. But you don't realize it's a distraction because it feels like work, right? It feels like it's productive. So anything can be a distraction, and anything can be traction. So if you want to play video games on your schedule and it's according to your values, there's nothing wrong with it. Why is playing a video game any different? Why is it worse than watching football on TV? What's the difference? There's no difference. It's just a pastime. It's the idea here is that you can do anything you want. I'm not going to tell you not to check Facebook or not to watch YouTube videos, or whatever you want to do is fine, as long as you do it on your schedule, not on somebody else's schedule. Do it according to your values, not according to someone else's values. So you got traction, you got distraction. Now, what pulls us towards traction or distraction is 2 things, 2 types of triggers. External triggers are the pings, the dings, the rings, all of these things in our environment that tell us what to do next with something outside of us. Now, those are the usual suspects. That's what people tend to blame when it comes to distraction. They blame the external factors. But it turns out that most distraction doesn't start outside of us. It starts within us. And this is what we call the internal triggers. So the reason that we do everything and anything is for one reason: to escape discomfort. Everything you do is about escaping discomfort, which means that time management is pain management. And so if we are to manage distraction, if we are to do what we say we're going to do, we have to find ways to make sure that we don't fall down this trap of whenever we feel lonely, uncertain, fatigued, tired, right? Well, whatever the case might be, our reflex, our habit is to turn to something to pacify these uncomfortable sensations. Instead, what we want to do is to harness those uncomfortable states to lead us towards acts of traction rather than distraction.
So, talking about that, when, for example, I just went into Uber this morning, and usually when I go into Uber, I do this weird thing, which is asking Uber drivers to turn off the radio. And I get this mixed response back. Half of them say, fine, you're the boss, you're paying for the trip, I'll do whatever. And like about the rest of the other half are like, I've never drove a car without a background noise in the background. I'm scared to death. Well, they don't say this, but they basically get mad at me for asking that question. So what I'm trying to figure out is, and from talking to people, and I'm sure you've done a lot more research than I did, but from my personal experience and talking to people, when I don't want to do something, I don't want to face that discomfort, like you're saying, inside of me. That's most of the times a huge opportunity for growth, I've found. Like if you really face that, and if you really look into it, and if you face the discomfort, you can realize you need to change your job. Like other things like that are fundamental. And we want to avoid and we want to completely run away, which is something we do very well. Very well. we have a master's degree in that for sure. So if you like coming back to the root causes of understanding why we're distracted in the first place, because I do know people Nir that have never read a book and are so passionate about what they're doing, and they don't even blink. I mean, there's like listening or watching to this podcast is not even a thing in their mind, because like I'm so attracted to what I'm doing. I'm pulled towards it so much that I don't like, I haven't even thought about being distracted, right? But most people are not like that. So do you think there's like a fundamental difference somewhere? Because it feels like some people just got it. Well, of course there's some things they're doing, right? But there seems so fundamentally different, right? What do you think on that?
You mean is it like an inborn trait?
No, like an inborn trait, but it feels like a fundamental rather than tactical difference in some people that are just completely able to have traction, not focus. Yeah. I was about to say focus, but have traction on things, and where others like us, like normal people, most people just have this hard time. I mean, trying to concentrate or focus or have traction, and they procrastinate all the time, right? Do you think there's a fundamental difference between those two types of people?
Paulo Coelho said that a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. And I think that kind of sums it up.
Oh, and that's like exactly what Albert said as well, right? But in different words.
It's how you decide you want to spend your time. And by the way, I'm not going to tell you how to spend your time. It's about how do you live out your values. Values are defined as the attributes of the person you want to become. And so if you want to spend your time doing whatever it is you want to do, I have no problem with how you want to spend your time. As long as you don't harm other people, you don't break any laws, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So my audience are the people who know what to do. I mean, with the internet, who doesn't have access to Google? We all know what to do. Come on. How many many gurus do we need to hear from? We know you want to lose weight. Okay. You know basically how to lose weight. You want to do better at your job? Do the freaking work. You want to have better relationships? Be fully present with people. This isn't a secret. We all know what to do. And if you don't know what to do, Google it. The problem is we don't know how to stop getting distracted. We don't know why. When we say we're going to do one thing, why do we not do it? Why do we go off track? And so it's the people who that bothers, the people who, want to live with personal integrity. One of the things that I would never want to be called, one of the worst put downs you could tell somebody is to call someone a liar, right? You would never want to be called a liar by your friends, by your family. That would be a terrible thing. And yet I'll be totally honest with you. I lie to myself every day. I would say I was going to exercise, but I didn't. I would say I was going to work on that big project, and I would procrastinate. I would say I was going to be fully present with people, and my mind would be somewhere else. I was lying to myself. And so that's who I wrote this book for. I wrote this book for me and for other people who struggle with the fact that they know what to do, but somehow aren't doing it. And it's not about technology. There's so many distractions in life. You can find distraction anywhere if you don't have the system to help you become indistractable. So that's why I don't like willpower. I think willpower and self-control, self-discipline, I think the whole concept is flawed. We don't need to depend on willpower and self-control and self-discipline. We need a system, because we know that willpower and self-control and self-discipline will always fail in the moment. That's not what successful people use. Successful people don't use willpower. They use a system.
Yeah, and I think you, Carl Newport, James Clear, you guys doing like this type of work, it seems like a similar direction in which you all guys are going. It's some great work in that direction. So I think because I was talking with some people about this interview and kind of like crowdsourcing some question, and one thing that popped up is that people said, okay, so I'm going to face my discomfort next time I feel like, let's say I want to do something. I want to get a project done or start working or whatever. And I realize that I'm having a discomfort that I'm trying to avoid. Now, I've seen this as a pattern. People don't really have any practical tools of dealing with that dragon inside themselves.
Right. Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, and
to tell you exactly what to do.
So can you walk through? And I was just watching a presentation. You gave a really, really good exercise for this, but can you give people like a 1 or 2 exercises that they could actually
Sure.
implement to face that dragon?
So the most important thing is the strategy, not the tactics. The strategy, if you can picture in your head a mental image of traction to the right, distraction to the left, external triggers, internal triggers, if you can think of those 4 steps in your head, that mental picture, that's the most important part. That's the strategy. Strategy or tactics are what we do. Strategy is why we do that. So you can find all kinds of tactics out there. What I wanted to give is a comprehensive, strategic look at why we get distracted. You can come up with your own tactics, but the book is full of tactics as well that work for me, but there are many, many others that people can implement if you understand the strategy. So when it comes to this very first step of how do we master our internal triggers, there are basically 3 big things we can do. We can reimagine the trigger, reimagine the task, and reimagine our temperament. And we can dive in as much depth as you want, but let me give you one very concrete tip that comes out of one of these steps around reimagining the trigger. The idea here is that we want to see this discomfort differently. You know, so many people in the self-help industry these days preach this philosophy that feeling bad is bad. And that is not true. That from an evolutionary basis, our species did not evolve to be happy. We didn't evolve to be satisfied with life all the time. We're not supposed to be, hey, everything's great. That is not how we are hardwired. Think about it. Let's use some common sense here. If our species was ever had a group of Homo sapiens who were happy all the time, who were satisfied with life, those people were probably killed and eaten by our ancestors. It would not be a good idea to have a trait to be satisfied. You would want a species to constantly be striving, searching, hunting, inventing, creating. To do that, we need these internal triggers of discomfort. If you're satisfied with life, you just sit there. You don't do anything. And so we are evolved. We have this trait. This is what helps us shoot for the stars. It's what helps us create great businesses, life-saving medicine, overturn despots. It's that disquietude that makes us do things. So feeling bad isn't bad. We need to get comfortable with the fact that we shouldn't have this unrealistic expectation that if we're not happy, if we're not satisfied, that something's wrong with us. Quite the opposite. You are built for dissatisfaction. The idea here is how do you harness that dissatisfaction towards acts of traction as opposed to escaping into distraction. I would argue that, back to this point of anything can be a distraction, anything that takes you out of that discomfort in a way that doesn't lead you to actually improve your situation can actually be a distraction itself. I know people who run, who exercise, who meditate, who pray to just not think about their problems. And it's not that those things are always distractions, right? I'm not anti-meditation or anti-exercise, of course. But if that's your only coping mechanism, is to escape your problems, that can also be something that leads to a distraction. I know people who are addicted, and I don't use the term lightly, addicted to exercise because they are escaping these uncomfortable feelings that they don't know how to deal any other way. So of course, it's a much healthier way than, drugs or other problems. But, fundamentally, we do it for the same exact reasons, about escaping discomfort. So what we want to do is to make sure that we have some tools in our toolkit that we can use to deal with discomfort in a healthier manner. So what do? When we feel like we are about to get distracted, one of the techniques we can use that comes from acceptance and commitment therapy is called the 10-minute rule. The 10-minute rule says that we can give in to any distraction, anything that might take us off track, whether it's eating that piece of chocolate cake, whether it's scrolling Facebook or Googling something real quick when we said we were going to work on a big project. We can give in to any temptation in just 10 minutes. Now, the reason this is so effective is that it's much better than strict abstinence. Abstinence is when you say to yourself, no, I will not do that. So it's kind of like when you pull on a rubber band. If you pull on a rubber band, you pull, you can't pull anymore. At some point, you have to let go. The rubber band doesn't just stop where you started to pull it. No, it ricochets even farther. And so the way the brain registers this cycle of don't do it, okay, fine, do it, is actually registered as pleasure. The relief of telling yourself to not do something can actually feel pleasurable. And so that actually reinforces the behavior we are trying not to do in the future. So as opposed to strict abstinence, we can use this technique of the 10-minute rule to allow ourselves to surf the urge. So for 10 minutes, I use this all the time. If I'm doing something that I feel like I have the urge to get distracted, whether it's to eat that piece of chocolate cake or whatever it might be, I tell myself I can give into that distraction in just 10 minutes. And for 10 minutes, my job is to either get back to what I wanted to do, get back to the task at hand, or surf the urge. Okay, surfing the urge is a technique where we ride out an uncomfortable sensation like a surfer riding a surfboard on a wave, right? We ride that emotion until it crests and then subsides. And what you will find is with just 10 minutes of surfing that urge, exploring it with curiosity rather than contempt, that the sensation, that internal trigger will crest and then subside away, then go away. 9 times out of 10, that's exactly what will happen. So that's just one technique out of dozens of others that we can use to master our internal triggers.
Yeah, and I've been using this specific technique for 4 months now. And I was using I had it as a different term, but I see it as the exact same thing. I had like observe, imagine, feel, and then action, which seems like exactly the same thing, but different terminology. And it completely changed because I had a tool now, right? Like I had a way to fight that. So I think that's fairly powerful. Powerful.
And that's the real idea here is that instead of impulsively checking, instead of escaping the discomfort, we're leaning into it. We're acknowledging there's nothing wrong with us, right? When it comes to distraction, people tend to fall into 2 categories. The blamers say, oh, it's my iPhone, it's Facebook, they're doing it to me. The shamers say, oh, there's something wrong with me. Maybe I'm an imposter. Maybe I'm no good at this. Maybe I'm lazy. There's something wrong with me, right? And we shame ourselves. This is what I used to do. That's not helpful because, in fact, it makes the problem worse. You feel worse about yourself, so you become more likely to look for distraction. Instead, we don't want to be blamers. We don't want to be shamers. We want to be claimers. Claimers claim responsibility for their actions. They acknowledge this isn't your fault, right? You didn't invent Facebook. You didn't invent iPhones. You didn't invent email. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility because you can't control what you feel. You can only control how you respond to what you feel.
Yeah, and there's so much literature on like the underlying feelings of guilt and shame and how it's driving so much behavior. It's almost unbelievable. Like if we would have like a magic spell, I mean you, because I think it would be better if you do it. There would be a lot of press around it. And you could like just turn off guilt and shame. Whoa, like that would be so unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, we have to, even those emotions, even guilt is a helpful emotion.
Yeah.
Brené Brown talks about how guilt is when you say to yourself, what I did was bad. Shame, however, is a pretty toxic emotion. Shame is not what I did is bad, it's I am bad. And that's almost never helpful because we know that shame can send us into this spiral of hating ourselves. And then we become more likely to drink, to watch too much television, to do something to take our mind off of how shitty we feel. Yep. And so that can be a very destructive emotion. But guilt can be very healthy, right? If you say to yourself, oh man, I feel guilty, that's what prods you to go apologize, to fix whatever it is that you did that was wrong.
And when you're looking at, and when you're looking at what people are doing, so they're doing all these techniques, and let's say they're still having problems. When you're looking at their activity, do you think there's ever a time to like maybe start questioning, maybe you need to change your job, maybe you need to change, like, because I think we're so guilty and fixed on things we should do, like we have to do this, we need to do that, and then maybe we start coping with things better, like with what you're suggesting, right?
I agree. I think this is part of the criticism.
Yeah.
This is part of the criticism for meditation, that you can't meditate all the world's problems away. You have to sometimes get off your butt and go help people, go change the world, fix things. You can't just, I don't accept this notion that pain is part of life and there's nothing you can do about it, so just meditate. No, we have to go do stuff. Now, meditation can be a wonderful practice to supplement the doing, but it shouldn't be a replacement for fixing things.
Yeah.
And so we only have 2 potential options. When we feel those internal triggers, we can either fix the source of the problem which sometimes might include looking for a less toxic work environment, fixing our troubles at home, repairing our relationships. That is part of what we can do to deal with these internal triggers, is to figure out why we are so agitated, what is causing us this discomfort. Or for some things we can't fix, right? Feeling stressed from time to time, anxious, nervous, uncomfortable is part of the human condition. And so for those instances, what we need to do is to learn tactics to cope with that discomfort in a healthier manner. But you're absolutely right. I encourage people, not to just learn the coping techniques, but to know the difference between when it's time to act and when it's time to learn how to cope.
And when you're looking at activities, for example, in your work, would you say that when you're doing your work every day, let's say you're now doing this podcast, you're going to do something else, you just had lunch before this, and you're writing, you're doing all this stuff. What would you say it's the sustainable rewards that you have in your work? Is that meaning? Is that excitement? Is that what is it, like the short term, right? Immediate feedback loop rewards that you have in your work now that are driving you?
There's a chapter in the book about how to play anything, how we can reimagine the task. Yeah. And I overturn a lot of apple carts in this book. And there's a lot of things, I think, pop psychology out there that I'm not a fan of. One of them is this idea of flow. I love, Csikszentmihalyi has this idea of flow. It's very powerful, but I haven't found how to, in the book, and I'm a big fan of his work. It's wonderful. I buy every book he ever writes.
Yep.
But he talks about how flow is this wonderful, magical state, but he only gives examples of people doing things they love, right? Like the basketball player and the surfer and the person who just loves doing that thing. How do you get into flow doing stuff you hate?
What about the project for school, right? Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to do this. How do I get, you're never going to get into flow if it's something you don't like doing.
Yeah.
And so I went to see someone else. I went to see Ian Bogost, who's a professor at Georgia Tech. And he has this philosophy called play anything. And he teaches through, I write about his research about how he says the way you learn to play a task is to not expect yourself to enjoy it. Right? And now how can that be? How can play not involve enjoyment? He says the point of play is not to have fun. The point of play is to occupy your mind and attention long enough to get through the task. So he says the way to do it is not by pouring a spoonful of sugar, right? The Mary Poppins method of, if I just have a reward at the end, that's going to make me want to do it. It turns out that those type of extrinsic rewards can decrease creativity. They can actually decrease motivation. So it's fine if it's something you have to do very, very rarely. But if it's a task you have to do more than once, it behooves you to learn these tactics to learn how to play the task as opposed to just having an extrinsic reward. And he says the way to do this is kind of counterintuitive. He says what you want to do is to focus more intently on the task and find the variability in that task, in that behavior. So he gives the example of how he used to hate cutting his grass. He hated it. And so what did he do? He didn't say, if I cut the grass, I'll give myself a beer, right? Instead, he said, I'm going to learn more about grass. I want to know all the different types of grass, what grows best in my area. And then he looked for the variability. He said, how quickly can I cut the grass? What's the most efficient pattern to cutting the grass? And he trained himself to turn those experiences into play. I did something similar with running. I hated physical exercise my entire life until I learned how to play this behavior of learning to run. I explored it more intensely. I got super into it. Even though I hated it, I got more intensely into that behavior. And then I looked for the variability. When I first started running, I would focus on the feeling, the sensation of wind in my hair. Stupid, doesn't really matter. But the point was I focused more intently on the variability of the experience. And that taught me to learn how to play that behavior. And so that's one of the tactics we can use for tasks that we don't really like to do that can help ease those internal triggers, right? By getting rid of some of that discomfort by dealing with it in a healthier manner.
So I think that's so cool because I haven't really thought about this at all, ever. But there's, now looking back, and I'll research this, but there seems to be an overarching bias oriented towards activities that are exclusively meaningfully engaging to you, right? And of course, maybe that's the example I gave with like those people that are naturally attracted to things. Maybe they had the luck, or maybe they figured out their way into getting into an environment in which they were meaningfully engaged with their activities. So all these things,
or they did an activity long enough to learn how to play it, then they started getting good at it, then they started getting interested in it, and now
positive
it's
feedback loop.
fun. Now they love it.
So you're basically saying, well, in my words, but let me know if I got it, but it's basically reframing the task in a way that it's you're oriented towards yourself, you're orienting it as a challenge and as a learning experience. So you can basically do that with anything, something like that.
Right, that if you can reimagine it, so it's reimagining the triggers, reimagining the task, and reimagining your temperament. It's all about seeing those behaviors differently, but formulaic, not, hey, think of it as fun, right?
Yeah.
No, the barrier, or the bar of having to enjoy it is too high of a bar. Okay, the idea is, how can you use this idea of traction versus distraction to, while you're doing a task, to capture your attention long enough to get through it.
So you have
That's
the
how
capacity.
We play anything.
So you have the capacity to do that's very cool, because ultimately you want to be able to do stuff, right? You don't want to be at the mercy of, if it gives me this, I'll do it. You want to be able to do it, right?
To do whatever it is you say you're going to do, whether it's fun or not fun, right? Because fundamentally, if you have this bar of it has to be fun, that means that if it feels bad, you're not doing it right.
And what do you mean?
To escape?
What do you mean by enjoyment, by the way? Is that like a meaningful like state? Is that like a pleasure like state? What type of...
Exactly. Yeah. So when we feel discomfort, most of us, when we get distracted, we'll run for something to take away that discomfort.
Yes.
As opposed to understanding that discomfort is part of the process, to talk to ourselves in such a way. So for example, one of the tools I talk about is about how you can use self-compassion to help you do what it is you say you're going to do. So as opposed to people saying, oh, I don't like this, maybe this isn't my passion in life, or maybe I'm not good at it, or, as opposed to feeling those type of sensations, which tell us to escape, instead what we might say to ourselves is, this is hard. Maybe this is what it feels like to get better at something, right? Like, what would you tell a friend? That's the best rule of thumb for how to be self-compassionate. And by the way, people who are more self-compassionate are much more likely to accomplish their long-term goals. The way we become self-compassionate is that we talk to ourselves the way we would talk to a good friend. So if a good friend was telling you that they were struggling on a task, that it was hard, would you tell them, oh, you should totally just quit that? No, you should teach them, you're getting better at it. This is what it takes to be a good writer, to do well at anything you want to do. Involves stretching and involves improving in some way, which oftentimes involves discomfort.
And how do you distinguish, just a quick question on this, and then two more questions and we're gonna wrap up and I'm gonna let you go, but this has been interesting. How do you distinguish between those activities and those activities that are genuinely so far outside of your strengths and capacity that you should not pursue them? Like, how do you distinguish between that? Because initially, like you said, it's a positive feedback loop. If you're good, you're going to like it. If you like it, you're going to do it more. So it's like, fine. On the things that you're talented in, whatever. And I don't want to get into that conversation because I'm most likely wrong on what talent means. But how do you distinguish between things that you should pursue, and this is the process, and just narrowly pursuing the wrong thing that's so far away of your strengths and
your values? Okay. The only way, your rock has to be your values. So values are the attributes of the person you want to become. And so if something is important to you, to have that as one of your values, to be the kind of person who takes care of their physical health, but you hate exercising. If you are the kind of person who, wants to have close relationships, but you're shy and that's hard to socialize, you're introverted. If you're the kind of person who wants a successful career, but the work is really tough, it's about understanding what your values are. What kind of person do you want to become? That has to be your guiding light.
And do you think, because the working definition I know, for example, of beliefs, and that's different, is, well, not the working definition, but from my research, you can tell somebody's beliefs by what they do, not what they say. Values are different in the sense that it's an aspirational
Right. It's an attribute. It's a trait. Now, what I do like about the connection here is that what I advise. So we've only talked about the first step. There's 4 big steps:
Yes.
master internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back external triggers, and prevent distraction with packs. We've only talked about step 1. Step 2 is about making time for traction. So step 2 is to take those values and turn them into time. Right. So if you say that physical health is important to me, that's something you value, where's that time on your calendar? If time with loved ones you say is important to you, is that time planned for? If, excelling at your job, at your studies, at your whatever it might be, if that's one of your values, you have to turn those values into time by putting them on your schedule.
And you give something in your book, and people will be able to read it about implementation intentions, which is a fancy kind of word. And I do know there's this thing called WHOOP, by the way, if you know of it. It's like a wish, obstacle, and it's like integrated the implementation intention into like a goal setting type of thing. I'm probably talking about a similar thing, but in your book, we talk about this, and you give people instructions on how to do it.
So making an implementation intention is just saying what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. So that technique of putting on your calendar a time box calendar where you're filling up your entire day is very, very effective. Now, I'm not saying you have to beat yourself up if you don't do everything you say, nor am I saying it's super rigid and you can never alter that schedule. No, I want you to once a week sit down and ask yourself, does the week ahead reflect my values? And how can I change the calendar to make it easier to follow? That's what we're doing. You need to think of every week like an experiment to see how you can make sure that you do what it is you say you're going to do week after week. And then also what we can do is we can share that calendar with our colleagues, with our boss, with our domestic partner, to synchronize our schedule with the various stakeholders in our life who we owe time to. This is a life-changing practice. Believe me, if you sit down for 15 minutes a week with your husband, your wife, your boss, just 15 minutes, and you show them this calendar, let me tell you, it is a life-changing practice. It will give them so much more visibility into how you spend your time, and will make you much more likely to do what it is you said you're going to do.
Yeah, and it's like, for the people that are using calendars, it's unbelievable to not use one. For people that are not using one, it's like almost unbelievable to use one. It's like something very weird that's going on. And like talking about your specific day, I'm curious how, because you give examples in a lot of presentations, all this, I think in your book as well, about how you orchestrate your time. But do you think that people don't use calendars because they're trying to avoid feeling even more disappointed with their performance? Because I think a calendar is an expectation, is like a standard. And once you set a standard with anything, you now have like for lack of a better term, like a God that will judge you type of thing, right? So you want to avoid as much as possible. Do you think that's why? Or
I'm not sure. I mean, it could be that the byproduct of living in a world with so much in it. Kierkegaard had this great quote that he said, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom." Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. That we live, and he said that 200 years ago. Today, it's even worse, right? We have so much freedom. We have limitless videos you could watch on YouTube, unbelievable articles and forums and things you could learn online anytime from anywhere. So of course, we're kind of dizzy with all this freedom. So maybe in past generations, when people were bored, they found something to waste their time until they couldn't, they got bored of that. And then maybe they did something productive, perhaps. Today, we have so many options. We have so many things that could potentially distract us that if we don't carve out the time to do what we say we're going to do, then we're definitely not going to do it, right? If you want to write that novel or start that side hustle or whatever it might be, start a business or whatever it might be that you want to do, it's not just going to happen, right? It has to be planned for. And look, I think the world is bifurcating into 2 types of people: the kind of people who let their time and their lives and their attention be controlled by other people, and the kind of people who say, no, I am indistractable. This is who I am. I'm the kind of person who I decide how my attention and my time and my life is controlled by me based on my values.
And as an action item for people, so hearing this, they listen to the podcast, we only have one more question, but what's one thing they could do after this? Should they like take a 4-hour break this weekend and like put out their goals, put out their values, and just I don't know, print that and put on
No,
the top
no,
of the
no.
like. What do you think it's?
I don't like the vision boards. I don't like the
Okay.
write down all your values. You want to do it with time. So I'll give you a link in the show notes.
But what do you do before the time? You just start over.
You just fill your calendar. You start.
Okay.
Don't worry about 5 years from now. Don't do the vision board. Don't do the death. The dying, the wishes of the dying. No. Let's do next week.
Wishes of the dying.
Just next week.
Yeah.
Right. How do you want to live your life next week to live according to your values? Not in retirement, but next week when you have a job and you have kids and you have an obligation, put that stuff in your calendar and then see how much time is left over to do the other things that are important to you in your life. Because if you don't plan that time, you know what you're going to do with it. You're going to check email. You're going to go on YouTube. You're going to putz around as opposed to doing what you really want to do. So I'll give you a tool for the show notes that it's totally free. You don't have to sign up for anything. It's a free tool you can use to time box your first week.
Okay. So we're going to have that in the show notes. I was expecting you to spell it out or something. So
yeah, I'll send it to you.
So yeah, because that's interesting. And do you have to because I'm trying to get very
I gotta go here. I'm sorry. I got 2 minutes until I have to go.
Okay.
Let's wrap up.
Yeah. So, and with that, then thank you so much for your time. And we'll leave it at that. I will ask you for the link for the show notes, and we'll have everything for people. Is there one thing you would like to leave people with that maybe you haven't been asked in the past or you feel is important, but you haven't talked about it that much?
Yeah, I think the most important lesson here is that we can do this. That I think that if we don't understand, this is an impulse control problem. It's not something that technology is hijacking your brain. It's not addicting you. We just need to decide in advance how we want to spend our time and then use this system to make sure we do it. So the mantra I want you to remember is that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought, right? That we can plan ahead. If you wait till the chocolate cake is on the fork and you're about to eat it, or if you wait till the cigarette's in your hand and you're about to smoke it, or your cell phone is on your nightstand and you sleep next to it every night, of course you're gonna lose, you're gonna give in. So the idea here is that you want practices in place so that you don't need willpower, so that you don't need self-control. The antidote to impulsiveness is forethought.
Okay, thank you so much, Nir. Appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great, amazing day. And we're gonna have your book and everything, and hopefully people are gonna read it and start taking more charge of their time and become indistractable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.